Latin American authors are great storytellers who weave their magic to entertain and absorb you. A Latin American tale entwines histories, turbulent politics, and insatiable passions and gives the traveller a rich insight into the culture and the freedoms of today's Latin American countries. Mario Vargas Llosa, a Peruvian author, once noted that as a consequence of the Spanish conquistadors banning the novel for 300 years, the South American storyteller has great difficulty in differentiating between fiction and reality. The mixing of the two has created a genre of literary narrative known as magic realism. Here is a taste from some of our well-known authors. Mario Vargas Llosa, a Peruvian, has written a lot of novels over his life, but these are two of my favourite. Aunt Julia and the Scriptwriter has also been made into a film, and it's a funny fictional account of a period of Vargas' life in the early days of the 1950s in Lima, when a young man falls in love with his aunt, and it's their satirical look at life as played through a Peruvian radio soap opera. A Fish in the Water is a memoir of Mario Vargas Llosa. It starts with his birth in 1936 in Arequipa in Peru, and it's the story of his organisation of the reform movement, which culminated in his bid for the Peruvian presidency in 1990. He writes the whole story of his presidential campaign from 1987 to 1990, and it ended in his defeat, and it put him back in a place where he truly belonged, that of literature, and the place where he truly said he was a fish in water. Now to Chile and to the author Isabel Allende. The House of Spirits. This book actually started my engagement with Latin American authors. The novel brings to life a family of over 3 generations whose private bonds of love and hatred are more complex but enduring than the political allegiances that set them all apart. This book actually is a good introduction to magic realism. The second book, A Long Petal of the Sea, I've only recently just read, and it starts in the late 1930s when the Civil War was gripping Spain. When General Franco and his fascists succeeded in overthrowing the government, hundreds of thousands are forced to leave as refugees to France. Together, the novel's principal characters embark with over 2,000 other refugees in search of a new life in Chile. They embrace exile and immigrate to Chile just as the rest of the world erupts in World War. The story of them adopting to their new home in Chile and negotiating conflicting agendas and even more political upheaval is unrelenting, and once again sees them fleeing as refugees. Now to Colombia and the author Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He's considered one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century, and this book, 100 Years of Solitude, is based on the fictional town of Macondo, and it tells the tale of the inhabitants driven by power, greed, love and lust, and whose history has been likened to the history of Latin America. The story combines realism and fantasy, and it's probably one of the best examples of the literary style known as magic realism. It was when I was travelling in Brazil that I came across Jorge Amado's books, and his work reflects an image of a very multicultural Brazil, and it depicts a very cheerful and optimistic country that also at the same time struggles with deep social and economic differences. Dona Flora and Her Two Husbands is a novel about a cooking teacher whose first husband is a charming lowlife. He's always disappearing in search of wine, women and song and roulette, and in her second marriage she is married to an upright, responsible, devoted pharmacist. For all his good qualities, turns out to be a lot duller and more reserved. It's meant to be a very good book for all married couples to read. Gabriella, Clove and Cinnamon is set in 1925, and it reflects the political and social changes sweeping Brazil at that time in an economic boom. With the influx of new people, professions and ideas, it brings plenty of changes and unsettles the old ways of doing things. These changes are reflected in Gabriella's life and her newfound freedom as a woman. The poetry of Pablo Neruda was actually introduced to me by the Director of South American Tourism Office, Henry. He's probably the most influential and widely read 20th century poet of the Americas. He's actually known for his technique of exalting experience, being spontaneous, and the directness of his passion. The urgency of his language is what has set him apart from other poets of the time. Now to look at some books that have been written by people who have travelled to different parts of South America and give you an interesting insight. The first one, which is a must-read for anyone going to Patagonia, is by Bruce Chapman, called In Patagonia. It's an exciting book. I think of his account of journeying through the southern tip of South America. It's full of very evocative descriptions, and his storytelling and amazing bits of history make it fascinating, from the Welsh immigrants to bandits like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Oh, Mexico by Lucy Neville was a book that I picked up a while ago, and I really didn't want to like her, but as I read the book I actually found that this very typical travel memoir was lit up with a lot of warmth and good insight into the Mexican way of life. She's got a really curious mind and a knowing eye, and it's an account of her living in Mexico City, the jobs that she takes on, the people, and of course the loves in her life there. Aku Aku by Thor Heyerdahl was the first book I read as a child about anything to do with South America, I think, and it's the account of his expedition to Easter Island to investigate the giant stone statues and the local and Polynesian history. The interaction between the local islanders and the expedition crew is actually a highlight of the book, but also it answers a lot of mysteries surrounding the large heads on Easter Island. Now to the book Barrow's Boys. This is one of my favourite books on my bookshelf. It's a great collection of British exploration expeditions in the 1800s to many parts of the unknown world. The stories are of extraordinary bravery and sometimes foolishness in the pursuit of glory for England. There's a number of chapters in Barrow's Boys that are dedicated to an expedition in 1839, led by James Ross in the ships the Erebus and the Terror. They spent 4.5 years doing the greatest exploratory in and around the Antarctic coast. They travelled further south than anyone had previously been. He named many of today's well-known landmarks such as Mount Erebus and the Ross Shelf. His encounters with Governor Franklin in Hobart, Tasmania, are fascinating for that era. Years later, Franklin himself led the ill-fated expedition to the Northwest Passage in the same two ships. They were famously lost and were never recovered.